Well, thanks. I'd just like to begin by thanking Annick Nandy for inviting me along today to this talk as part of the seminar series. As Annick said, I've known Annick for a long time now, and I was delighted to be his PhD supervisor a good few years ago. And so I've been following with great interest his trajectory as he's been moving around to different parts of the world and following his work. And I've been following this really interesting seminar series, which is a great initiative that Annick has developed over the years. So I'll just begin the talk then. I'm looking at new speakers and language policy, and specifically focusing on new geographies of language in minority language sociolinguistics. And so in this talk, I'd really like to reflect on some of the geospatial and territorial perspectives of minority language revitalization, which seem to have shaped a lot of our previous thinking, and indeed many of the language policy and planning initiatives which have been associated with the field. I'd like to examine specifically how the new speaker framework and the concept of new speakerness, which is a concept which I'll unpack a little more later on, how this concept might be used to sharpen our thinking of new geographies of language in minority language sociolinguistics. So I'd like to begin with a map here. And maps, of course, are ways in which geographies of language have been represented. And this is a map of Europe, as you can see. And like other maps you'll be familiar with, it's of course characterized by demarcated boundaries boundaries which are set to territorial confines and which shape nation states within the European nation state structure. And you can see here where many of the official languages corresponding to those nation states are clearly marked within these boundaries. So you have French in France, Swedish in Sweden, Norwegian in Norway, etc. And this particular map also includes what have been termed lesser used languages of Europe. So languages such as Irish, Galician, Breton, Basque, Sami, etc. And again, these are within defined geographical spaces. Absent from the map, of course, are the many non-historical languages of Europe, languages which arrived to Europe through migration, through transnational working, Turkish speakers in Germany, Polish speakers in Ireland, Arabic speakers in France, etc. So there's very little recognition in a lot of the maps that we find of multilingual subjects which cut across nationally defined geographical boundaries. So the territoriality principle has very much shaped European geographies of language and understandings of language, place and space, based on the idea that language should have an official status in a territory in which it's spoken. Territory, of course, has always been fundamental to the ideologies of nation building. And similarly, territory and space have been fundamental to the ideologies of many language revitalization movements linked to these languages. Many scholars have questioned the territoriality principle in relation to language spaces, as it is often seen, it is very much seen to be based on a bounded notion of language within these geographical spaces. And so this bounded notion of language and place can, of course, be traced back to European nation building, in which the one language, one nation ideology became very firmly ingrained. And within this context, many of Europe's languages became minoritized and pushed to the peripheries. The territorial principle was subsequently used as a political argument by many of these same minoritized groups to establish themselves as nations. And so this is led to a rather ironic situation, as Catherine Woolard has pointed out, that language revitalization movements seem to adopt the same monolingual ideologies around language and place, which had led to their subordination in the first place. So I'd also like to point out, while my focus is on geographies of Europe's minority languages, I would contend that the dynamics of European language revitalization movements and the processes of internal colonialism, which led to the minoritization of these languages in the first place, can of course be seen elsewhere in the world where we have similar processes of colonization and where similar monolingual ideologies were embedded through the colonial process. Linguistics and related strands, including minority language sociolinguistics, adopted rather unquestioningly the notions of European nation-state nationalism, which in turn formed the basis for many of the foundational concepts which have shaped linguistics as a field. These include the familiar concepts of native speaker and mother tongue, for example. Native language or native speaker has been seen as something organically or naturally owned as part of nation building. Indeed, as Maconie and Pennycook have pointed out, the understanding of language itself is something bounded, has been very much linked to the process of nation state building. So there has, as I said, been a rethinking of the territoriality principle. In a very interesting paper in 2013, Peter Auer, the linguist Peter Auer, in a paper entitled Geography of Language, Step Towards a New Approach, proposed a paradigm shift in the way in which linguistics and sociolinguistics conceptualize language, space, and place. And in particular, he questioned the principle of territoriality, which he argued assumes certain geographic spaces to be the natural habitat of a language, and a given language is assumed to have its own space. So languages, he argued, cannot be located in geographical space in the same way as other geographical features such as lakes or mountains. And he pointed out that the only link to a particular territory is that languages are spoken by the people who inhabit this territorial space. And as such, it is the speakers and not the languages that make up the space and who are able to shape language practices within those spaces as active agents in that process. So he recommended that speakers be moved center stage in any new approach to the geography of language. And so Auer's call for a more speaker-centered approach has to some degree been taken up in our recent collective rethinking of minority language sociolinguistics through the New Speaker framework and explored by scholars participating in a European cost action on new speakers in a multilingual Europe. And the underlying focus of our network was to understand how individuals and groups adopt and use a language variety other than their native language, and who by engaging with languages other than their native or national languages need to cross existing social boundaries and indeed geographical boundaries, and to reevaluate their own levels of linguistic competence and creativity and creatively restructure their social practices to adapt to new and overlapping linguistic spaces. So new speakers, defined in this way, can encompass a broad range of speaker profiles, from those who adopt and become speakers of a minority language, such as Irish, Galician, Welsh, Basque, Catalan, etc., or those who adopt dominant languages such as English or Spanish in the context of migration, or indeed those who adopt minoritized languages in the context of migration. So, for example, Polish speakers who become who adopt English as a second language, or who adopt Irish as a second language. However, I'd emphasize that what is important here is the focus on speakers and how social actors adapt their linguistic practices and need to adapt their linguistic practices as they cross these different spatial configurations and boundaries. So focusing on the speaker has allowed us in many ways to examine how people perform social actions through the language varieties in their lives and how they negotiate legitimacy and belonging and acquire social capital. The speaker perspective, and more specifically a sociolinguistics of the speaker, can in many ways allow us to identify who has access to which linguistic codes, how and where they are able to use them, what are the social consequences and economic consequences of such use, and looking at this across a wide range of settings in today's multilingual and globalized world. And the speaker focus moves us away from the tendency, which we often find in linguistics and sociolinguistics and related strands, to view languages as objects that certain groups of people are understood to legitimately and authentically possess. And so the speaker focus is an attempt to displace the idea of language as a means of intersubjective, communicative, and embodied relation, where language becomes a proxy of for understanding the social conditions governing language use. And so such an understanding, I would argue, is best achieved by focusing on the social actors themselves. And so the new speaker concept, rather than functioning as a category, was mobilized to work as a lens through which we could focus on speakers as social actors, to look at their trajectories and to examine their experiences. While framed more broadly as a lens to understand the dynamics of what it means to be a new speaker of a language in the context of a multilingual Europe, the concept itself has its origins very much in minority language sociolinguistics, where the term had become to be explicitly used. There are many variations of the term, and it has been used in different ways, for example, in Wales, in Ireland, in the Basque Country, and Brittany. And it's used to refer to individuals with little or no home or community exposure to a minority language, but who instead acquire it through immersion or bilingual education programs, revitalization projects, or as adult learners. And the emergence of this profile of speaker draws our attention to the ways in which minority linguistic communities are changing because of globalization and the new profiles of speakers that this new social order is creating. And so this concept existed already as a folk term in some contexts, particularly in the Basque context, where the term Euskaldun existed, and in the Galician context, where neofalante was used. And these were categories or labels that were used by the speakers themselves to self-define themselves or to self-define their own speaker identity. I suppose it's sometimes maybe an unusual context where this is I suppose the new speaker concept and the broadening of it is an anglicization, I suppose, of these terms which already existed and which already being used in minority language communities themselves to define different categories of speakers, or these specific categories of speakers. The way new speakers acquire and speak these minority languages, of course, differs from many of the linguistic communities of the past. So there's very often a break in the type of language that they're used, the very often associated with more standardized use of language compared to the more dialectal forms of speech associated with some of the traditional communities. As such, their presence in many ways unsettles some of the ideological tropes around language, identity, authenticity, and national belonging. And so it prompts us to rethink some of the received notions around language as bounded entities inscribed in certain geographical and territorial communities, as we find new speakers of these minority languages outside of the traditional heartlands, if you like. So minority language sociolinguistics, and in particular, the sociolinguistics of revitalization, has, like other strands of linguistics, tended to focus, as I mentioned, on language as an object of study. In much of the earlier work on language revitalization and endangerment, the focus was on saving the language from dying out. And these include seminal works such as Joshua Fishman's 2001 book entitled Can Threatened Languages Be Saved? And Leonore Grenoble and Lindsay Whaley's 2005 book on saving languages. The idea of saving the language, of course, prompts the question on what exactly is being saved and how that reflects the lived experience of the social actors within the community. The focus on language as opposed to speakers has also, it could be argued, led to an overemphasis on the past, with a static view of how language as an object evolves over time and across space. And so the salvaging leanings in certain strands of linguistics and linguistic anthropology sought to preserve indigenous languages in the same way as salvage anthropologists had done with indigenous cultures. And the documentation of endangered languages has been concerned with collecting very often the authentic speech from the last surviving native speakers. And so this reassembling of the past, again, a residue of romanticism, where rural peasant populations supposedly untouched by urbanity often came to be valorized as authentic sources of culture and linguistic knowledge. So behind a lot of the thinking around survival and the discussions around the last native speaker and salvaging linguistics are, of course, certain assumptions around language, which led to, in many ways, the trivialization of the relationship between language and space and place. And as I highlighted earlier, such thinking draws predominantly on monolingual ideologies about language, which assume that speakers only speak one language and are monolingual. It assumes that speakers are bound to places and that they're immobile. And it's based on the idea that space is a container that includes language. In traditional linguistic conceptions of language and space, the container view of space has underpinned a lot of Western thinking and is based on an absolute conception of space in which spaces exist prior to and independently of the objects they contain. Applying this to language spaces means that speakers are constrained by the language space in which they happen to find themselves, rather than the language spaces being created by the speakers themselves. So these underlying assumptions in linguistics and related strands very much, I've skipped a slide there, sorry. While mobility has always, as we know, been a feature of society, and its significance has intensified, of course, in the age of globalization. And over the past decade or so, we find a lot of discussion around the development of new paradigms which take into account the spatial and temporal features which define language, and which take into account language as something mobile through space and made for mobility, as Blumert has highlighted. Stephen May has talked about the move towards a multilingual turn in sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, and related strands. And we see a proliferation of terminology and new terms which help us to describe or understand or unpack this this new type of the new way, the multiplicity of languages. And the way in which, so we have terms like translinguism, translanguaging, metrolingualism, and so new speakers is one of these new terms, another term which basically helps us to frame language within the context of mobility. In a sociolinguistic of minority languages, a new approach to the geographies of language emphasizes the relevance of mobility instead of stability for language variation and change. And so it's about going beyond the idea of the geographical confines of stable communities of place, which were tied to territory, and moving towards an examination of the spaces, communities of practice and networks within which we can find these new communities of these new language communities. Socio-historical accounts, as we know, of language loss and decline have very often ignored the untidy nature of language shift, with calls for a more heteroglossic approach to the changing linguistic and cultural environment. And so a lot of the historical accounts that we have of language shift happening within these minoritized languages very often frames it within a discourse of language loss and decline, and an eventually leading to language death. The questioning of I think within all of this also, there has been a tendency to assume that rural communities were also stable communities. And so we also need to question the stereotypical notions around rural life as stable, because very often within these communities, language was also undergoing a lot of change, and the speaker communities within these speakers within these communities were also engaging in translingual processes and translanguaging. And so it wasn't just something that was happening in cities, but it was already, I would say, already happening in the context of rural populations. In minority language sociolinguistics, there has been for a long time a strong focus on the rural small town nexus, with much less attention to the dynamics of language revitalization in urban contexts. New spaces of interaction for minority languages have developed in towns and cities, and opportunities for the use of the language have developed very much as a result of language revitalization projects and language policies, particularly in the context of education. And we can see that examples of that in numerous places. For example, in Dublin, there are as many Irish speakers in the city of Dublin as there are in the traditional Gaeltacht areas. In cities like Glasgow, the number of Gaelic speakers has grown substantially and is on par with some of the more traditional communities. In cities like Bilbao in the Basque Country, we see a growing number of new speakers of Basque. And while there has been a lot of research, particularly in the context of multilingualism in urban contexts, there has been, I think, less attention given to minority languages in urban spaces, and the new spaces which they are creating, and the new types of interaction which they are developing. However, while geographies of language are changing for new speakers beyond their traditional communities of practice, it's not without its challenges, particularly for language policy and language planners. And a lot of the issues which new speakers of these languages in urban contexts are encountering are not adequately, or not yet adequately addressed, or policymakers and planners are struggling to address some of the challenges that they're facing. For example, there is often a lack of a physical hub or a physical space within larger areas where speakers can come together as a group. So very often communities of practice exist as networks of speakers rather than as a tightly knit community. Service provision is very often not sufficiently targeted for new and existing speakers within large urban areas. And opportunities for language use can be sometimes limited, particularly in networked contexts where finding other speakers or finding other people with whom to interact may be limited. Networks, when they are formed, of course, are sometimes difficult to sustain over time. This can be due to the fact that people move around. If the network is small, then the loss of 1 or 2 speakers can mean the total decline of that particular network, and then a new one needs to be formed. Language use can be sometimes seen as marked behavior, and in a lot of the research that we have done on new speakers in urban contexts, we have found that it's sometimes seen as deviant and out of place, and so therefore does not perhaps encourage newcomers to the language to make that leap of faith and to adopt the minority language in a context where it's not fully conducive to its use. Joshua Fishman used the interesting notion of breathing spaces. So in the absence of physical spaces, he talked about the importance of creating breathing spaces for minority languages, spaces in which there is less pressure for speakers who are also speakers of a dominant contact language to switch to that dominant language. In some of my own work and my own recent ethnographic work in Galicia, the concept of breathing space works quite well in defining some of the ways in which new speakers of Galician in urban contexts such as Vigo and Santiago de Compostela carve out new spaces of interaction, both symbolically as well as more concretely through permanent places, including alternative bars, social centres, and immersion schools. And so ethnographic studies of breathing spaces such as this allows for a more phenomenological version of relational space, which introduces the human experiencer, specifically the speaker, as the reference point from which spatial relations originate. It allows us also to focus on how space is actively construed by the speakers themselves, be it fleeting interaction, or as within a particular space, or as in more permanent places, and spaces which are socially meaningful, and that are relevant because of the type of activities that take place within them, and the particular values that are ascribed to them, and the social conventions that are associated with them. So I'll just have a look at some of the excerpts from discussions and fieldwork which I conducted in various cities in Galicia over a number of years, which allows us to get an insight into the way in which new geographies of languages are being interpreted by speakers themselves within these new spaces of interaction. And so the first one I'd like to share with you is from Clara, and this is an interaction which I recorded in a centro social, or a particular place where people have come together, created this particular space and made it a Galician speaking space. And Clara is here talking about her child, who she has decided to bring up speaking Galician. Clara is herself a new speaker of Galician, in the sense that she was brought up speaking Spanish in the home, but learned Galician through the education system, and then made a conscious decision to become a neofalante, or a new speaker of Galician. And she has committed to speaking only Galician with her child. She's committed to only speaking Galician to everyone, for that matter. And so essentially she has become what she described herself as a monolingual speaker of Galician. Here she's talking about how her interactions with her child and the education system. So for example, she says she can speak Spanish at school, but with me, she has to speak Galician. I don't want her here, don't want her speaking a mixture. I want her to speak both languages well. I mean that she learns the two languages, not adding Spanishisms in Galician nor Spanishisms in Spanish. And she should speak the two languages perfectly as two languages that are completely different, and that, well, in her school context, she wants to speak in Spanish, and that in the family setting that she should speak in Galician, in the same way that she can learn English and speak it when she goes to the country where English is spoken. But she should learn the language that she doesn't have a mixture of the two languages. For me, that is fairly ugly. So we can see a lot of even though the geographies of language have changed for these new speakers, their ideologies about language and their ideologies about the way in the bounded nature of language and the bounded nature of the spaces in which it's appropriate to speak Galician are very much linked to what you could refer to maybe as a monolingual type of ideology coming across here. So there's a clear separation of the languages, Spanish at school, Galician at home, and no mixing of language, as she says in the end. For me, that is fairly ugly. This example is the second example, which I'd like to share with you, is from Maria. Maria is a teacher in a Galician immersion preschool in the city of Ferrol. And Maria was, again, a new speaker herself, brought up speaking Spanish in the home, and who made a conscious decision to become a Galician speaker in her teenage years. In this particular school, the language policy of the school is a Galician only policy. So it's a school in which there is it's considered, it's described as a complete immersion school in Galician, and it was set up in reaction to dissatisfaction amongst groups of Galician parents who saw that the official education system, which is officially bilingual, was not giving the Galician input which they wanted for their children. So this teacher, even though she is making a very conscious decision to speak Galician, she admits to the fact that she struggles with this, and she says, this is something that I always do, and what she's referring to here is mixing. Here, meaning in this school, I make a very big effort not to. I try not to use Spanishisms, but my brain goes back automatically to what I have been doing for years. I've been carrying Spanishisms with me for years. So there's constant struggle and a resistance to mixing, a resistance to translanguaging, and which in this context, because it's seen as a safe place or as a breathing space for Galician, where all Spanish needs to be excluded from this space. So it's in creating, or an attempt to create, a safe haven for the language, there is a lot of struggle and tension around keeping the dominant language out. So these and other examples show that Galician new speakers consciously invest in language separation. And they do this very often, contrary to the advice of by scholars that translanguaging can offer a smoother path to the protection of minoritized communities. And as new speakers, they create, or they try to create, safe islands to organize a diglossic compartmentalization between Galician and Spanish, and to strive for a pure Galician. So as I said, even though their geographies of language have changed, the way in which they are dealing with language and their ideologies around language are very much based within the traditional ideologies. Jackie Urla and her colleagues have very much called on scholars to question what she calls the reproduction thesis. So the reproduction thesis is where the same ideologies, or the same monolingual ideologies in this case, are being reproduced by these social actors. And so while at a glance we may perhaps be critical of these monolingual ideologies, or we may label them in some instance as essentialist type of ideologies, we also need to be careful, I think, in over-criticizing them by looking closely at the rationale behind the speaker's choices. Why is it that they find it necessary to do this? Why is it necessary that they need to consciously invest in this in language separation in an attempt to create these safe spaces, in an attempt to create these breathing spaces for Galician, which they perceive to be threatened because of its situation within a community in which it's a minoritized language. However, this is not without problems, I think, in their efforts to avoid language mixing and mixed language spaces. Galician new speakers can, of course, face the risk that such spaces become exclusionary, that they inhibit the conversion of potential new speakers to active speakers. And this can also lead to new types of conflicts and new types of tensions around language ownership, about who's accepted as part of the group, who's actually a group, can be considered a group member, or who can be classified as what some new speakers have described as a real speaker. So this leads me on to the point of intersectionality within these spaces, and how different profiles of speakers, how those people from different backgrounds, different social classes, different ethnic backgrounds, to what extent these type of factors influence access to these so-called breathing spaces. And of course, a lot of the work on new speakers of minority languages has focused on so-called local new speakers. So that is people who were from the local community, who were brought up speaking the dominant language, and who switched to the minoritized language. But as geographies of language change, and the influence of international migration has brought newcomers into the community. This is an example here in Ireland of Ola McAdoomney, who has written a very interesting article, Black Irish Lives, Will Gorger and the broadcaster and the future of the Irish language. And she points out that she said, I cannot imagine my life now without Irish. And so this opens a lot of questions around the way in which these communities, or minority language communities, have changed because of not only internal changes in geographies of language, but also in geographies of language which go beyond the territorial confines of the nation state itself and of the communities in which these languages were traditionally found. Going beyond geographical boundaries and territorial space, of course, also brings us into the realm of virtual communities and virtual space. And there has been quite a lot of work done in recent years which highlights the role of social media and virtual spaces in providing spaces for minority languages to be used, and as ways of connecting speakers with each other who would otherwise perhaps not be connected. And so this, I think, has become even more apparent during the pandemic, and the COVID crisis, I suppose, has highlighted the ways in which these virtual spaces have become even more increasingly important. And so in a piece of work that we did recently on the Gaelic online communities, which emerged during COVID, shows the way in which, shows the global reach of these online fora, and the where geographical spaces in a lot of ways disappears, and where the rural-urban dichotomies, which very often are a point of contention within these local communities, often become blurred and sometimes even disappear. So I'll just share with you a vignette from one of the sessions from this virtual conversation group, which took place on a weekly basis and which continues to take place online. And so this was a weekly conversation group which used to take place face-to-face. And so the notes here refer to the fact that this week's online conversation group, there were 30 people. This was an increase in the usual 6 to 7 people who would have attended the Wednesday evening face-to-face session and who made it out on a cold, rainy winter night. In the breakout rooms, people introduced themselves within these spaces. They said a bit about when and where they had learned Gaelic and where they came from. This evening, there were participants from all over Scotland, a participant from England, Ireland, Malta, Australia, the US, and Brazil. The Australian participant was particularly interested in talking about the townland on the Isle of Lewis, where her ancestors came from, and lamented the decline of the language, referring to it as the real Gaelic. So I think what's interesting about this is that in these new virtual spaces, even though the idea of territory has been removed and we're moving beyond territorial space, many of the participants within this group still found it important to talk about place, to talk about space, and to talk about territory, and often quite explicitly so. So one of the main questions, the main icebreakers in conversation was, where are you from? Where in the world are you calling from? What town are you in? What place are you in? And as the Australian participant here founded a way of reconnecting with places that she had visited in her childhood, places where she had had ancestral links to the language, and where, again, she talks about, lamented the decline of the language, referring to the Gaelic spoken there as real Gaelic. So very much traditional geographies of language coming across in the discourses of the participants and of these new speakers within the group. So new geographies of language in minority language sociolinguistics open many opportunities, but they also lead to, I think, many challenges. And some of these, which we have had a number of discussions around recently, particularly with Colin Williams, who has done a lot of work in the area around geography of language, and who has been very much engaged in our network of new speakers, has questioned whether we can sustain viable language networks for minority language speakers, old or new, within spatial and without having spatial or geographical reference, and questioning, I suppose, the role as well with digital resources play in an era of deterritorialization. And the quote that I'd like to finish on from Colin Williams is it then the postmodern expression of the territorial imperative where the same virtues of security, stimulation, identity could be enjoyed? So when rethinking the ways in which new geographies of language have opened up spaces and provided new opportunities for minoritized languages and languages such as Irish, Galician, Basque, and Catalan, etc., it also presents numerous challenges to the speakers within these communities, in adapting to these new types of networks, new ways of communicating, and sometimes outside of the types of spaces in which they were traditionally, in which the languages were traditionally used. On the other hand, it opens up opportunities to expand the network of speakers, to expand it beyond the territorial space in which the language was traditionally found, and to open up new opportunities for speakers who would not, who previously have come to the language. It also opens up opportunities, I think, to rethink some of the traditional divides which we have sometimes obsessed over between rural and urban, when in fact a lot of the communities within rural communities and urban communities can learn and benefit from each other substantially. Thank you.